Today we have the U.S. Senator from Illinois, Tammy Duckworth. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's good to be on. Thanks for having me.
So let's start off with the war in Ukraine. One issue that we're contending with right now is how to continue arming Ukraine without Russia interpreting that as a provocation. And granted, I know that Russia's interpretation of provocation is pretty arbitrary, but still, how does the U.S. approach this issue of defending democracy while avoiding direct conflict with another nuclear power?
To do what we've been doing, which is to be providing them with, in fact, millions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of anti-tank, anti-aircraft artillery missiles, stingers, javelins. We've been providing, coming through Poland, and supply lines that are being manned by the Ukrainian military, significant arms and ammunition that they need to defend the nation. And in fact, part of the reason they've been as successful as they have been has been because we've been able to provide them with the weaponry they need to fight the Russians.
Just recently, Poland's deputy prime minister, I believe a day or two ago, has called for international peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, which is basically just a thinly veiled code for pitting NATO troops directly against Russian troops. I'm assuming that our top priority here should be avoiding a direct conflict with another nuclear power, like I'd mentioned before. What's your position on this? And are we going to see more? Are we going to see more officials abroad, but possibly at home, calling for these types of stuff like a no-fly zone, stuff like peacekeeping missions in Ukraine?
Well, the issue with the peacekeeping mission in Ukraine is that it would have to be agreed to by the Russians. And so far, Vladimir Putin has actually violated every humanitarian corridor agreement that they've agreed to. I mean, so far, they've agreed multiple times to corridors to get, for example, humanitarian aid, food, water, medical supplies into Mariupol. And every single one of those has fallen, and the Russians have violated those agreements within hours of agreeing to them. So if they won't even adhere to an agreement that they made for a matter of hours to bring medical supplies, I don't know that we can count on them agreeing to a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. They have to agree that they want peace in Ukraine. And right now, it doesn't seem like the Russians want peace there.
With that said, Putin's threatened nuclear attack. We hear that on one hand, he's a rational actor and wouldn't subject himself to the assured destruction that would come with launching a nuclear war against NATO. At the same time, we also hear that he's becoming increasingly unhinged. And at this point, he knows he lost. So his only option is basically going down with the ship in a blaze of glory. Where do you stand on this? And should Americans be worried about the prospect of Putin using nuclear weapons?
We should be worried about the prospect of him using nuclear weapons because I think it's very much within the realm of possibility that he would do it. I don't think of him as any of the things that he's done as a rational actor at all, because none of this is rational. It makes no sense for him to have invaded Ukraine the way he did. He's destroyed his own economy. His GDP, his GDP has dropped by 10%. He's just shown the world that he has essentially a hollow army. He was supposed to roll right in and take over Ukraine, and
72 hours.
Yeah, right. We have fought them off. So he's actually shown the incompetence and the lack of training and the utter hollowness of his own military, and he's really degraded Russia's stature in the world. And his stated purpose, which was to stop the encroachment of NATO, all he's done is actually made NATO stronger because, the Germans have finally agreed, what, we're going to actually now spend 3% of our GDP on military equipment. And he's actually united NATO and made it even stronger. So none of the decisions he's made has been rational, which is why I think it's important to be very wary of his willingness to use nuclear weapons, because I think he would be.
And just to build on what you said about the strengthening of NATO, we now have other countries who are inquiring about joining NATO that wouldn't have happened before. Finland, Sweden. So, just to kind of build upon exactly that. I know a lot of isolationists are looking at this, not caring much about, a couple countries on the other side of the world and saying, why should we care? Why should we risk anything here to go help Ukraine? What would be your response to that? What are the broader implications of a Russian victory in Ukraine, both for Europe and democracy across the world?
Well, what it says is whether or not we're willing to defend democracy and whether or not we are willing to keep our word. And it's not just Europe that's watching. Asia is watching. China, the PRC is watching very carefully what's happening. And they're learning lessons from Russia's failure. And they're learning lessons from the fact that Europe very quickly united. China has been watching to see if the United States will stand with Taiwan should they decide to annex Taiwan. Countries like India are trying to figure out, do they align themselves with Russia, which is kind of their tendency to be, but now they're wondering, maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't. So the rest of the world is watching. And frankly, it's not just about national security in terms of armaments, it's about economic security as well. These are nations that are competitors to the United States and to the Western world. And frankly, if we don't stick together, if we don't show a united front against aggression like this, against folks who don't respect territorial, a nation's territory and a nation's sovereignty, that tells Asia, for example, or nations in Africa, that you can't count on the United States. You can't count on Western powers. You can't count on these countries that say, hey, go with democracy and capitalism because that's the way to go. They're going to say, you know what? The authoritarianism, that seems to be the way that's working. That worked for Russia. That's going to work for the PRC. Maybe that's the way we go. That is going to be detrimental to the well-being of democratic nations.
Well, you'd mentioned something similar happening with China and Taiwan. Obviously, China and Russia are different in the sense that Russia doesn't create a fraction of what China does in the world. I mean, so many countries' economies are wrapped up in Chinese manufacturing. It's easier for NATO countries in the Western world to basically allow Russia to become a pariah state, but China's not in that boat. So what would you anticipate would happen if China were to do something similar with Taiwan?
Well, it's not that easy for the Western nations to push Russia off. Remember that Europe, for example, relies on a significant amount of its energy from Russian oil and Russian gas. And so what China is watching is to see how much pain are Western nations and NATO nations willing to bear in order to isolate Russia and to cut Russia off from that global economic regime. And that will be an indicator to them in terms of how willing the world would be willing to cut off China from the rest of the world's economy. And I think by standing strong, what we're showing other parts of the world is that, you know what, it's time for us to start building an economy that is not so reliant on China. We learned that during the pandemic, right? That so much of our supply chain is so dependent on the PRC that we realized we need to start and reinvest in manufacturing and reinvigorating our supply chain manufacturing. Maybe not all in the United States, although that would be my preference, but maybe in friendly third countries, in places like Indonesia and Thailand and those places that can also do manufacturing in a cost-effective way. It doesn't all have to happen in Shenzhen, China. And so I think that there are lessons learned here. And part of that lesson is how much pain is the Western world willing to put up with in order to isolate Russia? And I think we're showing that we're willing to put up with an awful lot.
Speaking of that very issue of gas prices, that's not just an issue that Russia controls. I mean, these are American oil companies that are now seeing record profits as a result of raising their prices and kind of hiding under the pretense of inflation because we've seen it in so many other sectors: meat, foods, everything else, clothing, cars. Now, there's now talk of an investigation into price gouging in the oil industry. The cost of crude went from $130 a barrel to $95, and yet the average prices at the pump went from $4.33 all the way down to $4.32. What can Congress and the U.S. government do in terms of oversight of this industry?
Well, I'm actually introduced legislation that will address this very issue that would make it illegal for price gouging, for oil companies to price gouge. In fact, it's based on what happened after Hurricane Katrina. The legislation was first actually written in the House of Representatives to go after people who price gouge, energy companies that price gouge after Katrina. So we've shown that we can do it before we make it illegal. And I'm actually introducing legislation to that effect. We can also tax oil companies on the extra profits that they're making through price gouging as well. and tax them at a much higher level. And in fact, oil company executives have made statements. I mean, this is the most ridiculous thing. How arrogant are you to in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of the horrors that you see in Ukraine, say, yeah, we could actually lower gas prices, but we're just not willing to pump more oil because we'd rather buy back stock, or we'd rather pay more dividends to our shareholders than bring down gas prices. I mean, they literally said that, and so we need to hold them accountable for that type of gouging behavior, because it's not acceptable.
Now, speaking of that windfall tax, does the gas price issue seem to be having any impact on those on the right whose insistence on protecting oil companies is entrenching this exact problem? Like, is there any movement, or are those oil and gas donations just too good to pass up?
It seems to me like it's too good to pass up. They're not. While they want to send more weapons and do everything we can in Ukraine, they don't seem to be willing to do anything with the gas companies, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah, and then of course you have someone like Kevin McCarthy who's come out and thrown every excuse in the book at Joe Biden to blame him solely for the rise in gas prices, while ignoring the fact that you have these oil executives like you just mentioned who are coming out and saying not only do we have record profits to the tune of $174 billion across just four major oil companies this year, but that we have no expectation of increasing supply, because that would hamper our ability to issue these stock buybacks and major dividends to shareholders. More broadly, what are Democrats doing in the face of Republican opposition to bring costs down for consumers, not just in oil and gas, but just across the board?
Well, we've identified a bunch of areas that we're working on. I'm doing the price gouging, for example. So that's my piece of legislation that I am working on. We're also working on pharmaceutical pricing, for example. I would love to go right to allowing Medicare to negotiate for lower drug prices. Not every Democrat is on board with that. We know we won't get any Republican votes. So we would need all 50 Democrats plus the vice president. So our position is, let's pass something. Let's at the very least cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month, so that families don't have to choose between insulin to take care of their child's diabetes or food or rent. There are stories of children as young as 8 or 10 rationing their own insulin because they don't want to be a burden on their parents, because the insulin bill is $300 or $400 or $500 a month, and that's not acceptable. We're the richest country on the face of the earth. Our kids should not be self-rationing insulin. And by the way, this is a drug that's been around for well over 100 years. It shouldn't cost more than $35 a month. And so we can start to lower the cost of pharmaceuticals, and let's do it in a logical way that makes sense, that respects the free market, but at the same time say, you know what, you don't get to gouge. You don't get to go out, by the way, and buy all the manufacturers of the EpiPen of an auto, an auto injector, and then double the price, for an EpiPen, so that kids with allergies have no other choice than to pay $600 for one syringe, right? So you don't get to do that.
I think it's telling too that you have all of these Republicans who are coming out and attacking the left because of high prices on everything, and yet in the face of all of these solutions, from this price gouging bill that you yourself are working on, to all of the elements of Build Back Better, to the standalone elements, lowering prices for childcare and pre-K and drug prices, that they're opposed to all of it, and so they'll wail about these issues, and yet when it comes time to actually supporting any of the solutions, even one, there's a 0% buy-in from the right.
They don't support any of it. And by the way, when there's things like the American Rescue Plan or the bipartisan infrastructure deal, they won't vote for it. Only a handful of Republicans voted for the bipartisan infrastructure deal, and yet you see Republicans showing up all the time trying to be at the groundbreaking ceremony.
Right.
Things that they didn't vote for.
Let's end with that very issue. You've been involved with the clean water provision of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and that would remove lead from the water. We've been hearing about lead in water in places like Flint, Michigan for literally as long as I can remember. I don't remember a time where we weren't talking about that issue. You yourself were in hearings in the House where, you had a woman with a baby bottle, a clear baby bottle, and there was brown water in it. Can you talk about the fact that this is finally getting done?
It's finally getting done. It was very bipartisan as well. I'm very proud of that. My Drinking Water and Wastewater Act DOEA. We come up with such great acronyms here in Washington, I guess. But I've been working on getting the lead out of our drinking water supply now for over 10 years. And it took a Democratic majority. And it took me getting to the point where I was the chairwoman of the Committee on Water, and a president who supports eliminating 100% of the lead service lines in this country, coming together all in one moment in time to get this passed. And my bill got 89 votes on the floor of the Senate, when the regular order got 89 votes. That's pretty bipartisan. You don't get much more bipartisan than that, and I'm very proud of it. And the goal is to get rid of 100% of the lead that exists today in our drinking water system, and also to make sure that our municipalities have the dollars to fix their wastewater and their sewer systems, because many of those have not been fixed in decades.
Well, thank you not only for the work you're doing, but for continuing to push stuff like this through that hasn't gotten done before, even though it's 2022. It's far too long. But thank you for the work you're doing now and finally getting it done. Senator Duckworth, I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.